They say revenge tastes sweetest when served cold. But in my case, it wasn't about revenge at all. It was about respect. Sitting across from my father at that Thanksgiving table as he dismissed my career to his colleagues, calling me just a secretary, with that dismissive wave of his hand, I felt a strange calm. Because in exactly 12 hours, he would walk into the boardroom and discover that his new managing partner, the one who would determine his future at the firm, was his own daughter. The daughter he never thought would amount to anything in the business world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aroma of roasted turkey and fresh-baked pumpkin pie filled my parents' home, but all I could smell was the stifling scent of my father's expectations. Expectations I'd never been able to meet, at least not in his eyes. The house buzzed with conversation as my father's legal colleagues and their families gathered for our annual Thanksgiving celebration. My mother floated between groups with practiced ease, the perfect hostess as always, while my younger brother, Jake, held court near the fireplace, regaling everyone with stories from his first year at law school. My name is Olivia Mitchell. Until yesterday, I was just the daughter who had settled for a corporate job instead of following the family tradition of practicing law. At least, that's how my father, Jonathan Mitchell, founding partner at Mitchell, Reynolds and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, had always seen me. I had stopped by the kitchen to refill my wine glass when I overheard my father's voice from the adjacent dining room. He was speaking to Douglas Harrington, a senior partner at a rival firm who had recently joined my father's practice. "And what about your daughter?" Douglas was asking. "Olivia, right? What field of law did she go into?" There was a brief pause, just long enough for me to know what was coming. "Oh, Olivia?" My father's voice carried that familiar note of dismissal that I'd heard 1,000 times before. "She's not in law. She's just a secretary at Morrison Enterprises. Corporate work, you know. Decided the law wasn't for her." Just a secretary, 3 words that erased my MBA from Wharton, my 6 years of strategic consulting at McKinsey, and my recent appointment as Morrison Enterprises' new chief operating officer. 3 words that negated everything I had built outside the narrow path my father had envisioned for me. "Dad's still hoping I'll come to my senses," I said, stepping into the dining room with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Douglas looked momentarily uncomfortable, but my father merely shrugged. "Well, it's not too late to consider law school," he said, swirling the scotch in his glass. "Jake's thriving at Harvard Law. First year and already catching the attention of his professors." "I'm happy for Jake," I said evenly, "but I'm also quite happy with my career choices." "Of course you are, sweetheart," my father replied, with that patronizing smile he reserved for what he considered my youthful stubbornness. "And there's nothing wrong with administrative work. Every firm needs good support staff." Douglas cleared his throat. "What exactly do you do at Morrison, Olivia?" Before I could answer, my father interjected. "She's executive assistant to one of their VPs, aren't you, Liv? Scheduling meetings, managing correspondence, that sort of thing." I took a slow sip of my wine. For 6 years, I had corrected him each time he diminished my role. For 6 years, I had patiently explained the complexity and importance of my positions. For 6 years, he had nodded politely and then immediately forgotten, or chosen to forget, every word I said. "Something like that," I replied, choosing my battles. Tomorrow would bring clarity enough. "Dinner's ready," my mother called from the doorway, providing a welcome interruption. As everyone moved toward the dining table, Douglas touched my arm lightly. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Morrison Enterprises is a powerhouse. Any position there is impressive." I thanked him with a genuine smile, appreciating his attempt at kindness. If only he knew what Monday would bring. The truth was that 6 months ago, I had been recruited to join Morrison Enterprises as their chief operating officer after spending years helping companies streamline operations and maximize profitability at McKinsey. The CEO, Eleanor Morrison, had personally sought me out after seeing my presentation at a business conference in Chicago. What had started as a consulting engagement had transformed into an offer I couldn't refuse, a C-suite position with equity, in one of the fastest-growing corporations in the Northeast. But that wasn't all. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor had called me into her office with surprising news. Morrison Enterprises was expanding and needed specialized legal expertise. They were acquiring a controlling interest in a mid-sized law firm with an excellent reputation but outdated management practices. A firm that could benefit from modern operational leadership while providing Morrison with dedicated legal services. That firm was Mitchell, Reynolds and Associates, my father's life's work. "We're not looking to dismantle it," Eleanor had assured me. "Just modernize it, make it more efficient, more profitable. And given your background, I thought you might be the perfect person to oversee the transition." "My father is the founding partner," I'd said, still processing this unexpected collision of my professional and personal worlds. "Yes, and he'll remain a key figure," Eleanor replied. "But as majority stakeholder, Morrison Enterprises will be installing a managing partner to align the firm with our corporate structure. I'd like that person to be you, Olivia." I had taken the weekend to consider the offer, wrestling with the implications. I knew my father's firm was struggling. He'd never admit it. But industry whispers had reached me even before I joined Morrison. The old guard of legal practices was facing unprecedented challenges from technology, changing client expectations, and more nimble competitors. My father, brilliant as he was in the courtroom, was resistant to change, clinging to traditions that were slowly suffocating his firm. Taking this role meant I would effectively become my father's boss. The daughter he had dismissed as just a secretary would be responsible for restructuring his life's work, evaluating his performance, and ultimately making decisions that would shape the future of his legacy. I accepted the position on Monday. The acquisition was finalized on Wednesday. And now, sitting at my parents' Thanksgiving table listening to my father extol the virtues of Jake's first semester law school grades, I was the only person in the room who knew what Monday morning would bring. My father raised his glass in a toast. "To family traditions," he said, looking pointedly at Jake, "and to the next generation of Mitchell attorneys." I raised my glass with the others, a small smile playing at my lips. "To new beginnings," I added. My father had no idea how prophetic those words would be. The remainder of dinner passed in predictable fashion. My father dominated the conversation with stories from recent cases, legal anecdotes that had his colleagues nodding appreciatively and my brother hanging on every word. My mother periodically tried to include me in the conversation, a well-meaning but transparent attempt to give me some visibility. "Olivia just got a promotion, didn't you, dear?" she offered during a brief lull. "Oh." My father's interest was perfunctory at best. "Congratulations. Moving up in administration, are you?" "Something like that," I repeated, the same answer I'd given earlier. 6 years of corrections had taught me that providing details would only lead to more dismissal. "Well, that's nice," he said before turning to Jake. "Speaking of advancement, Douglas mentioned that his firm is already scouting for summer associates. With your first semester performance, you should be at the top of their list." And just like that, my promotion, my ascension to the C-suite of a billion-dollar corporation, was reduced to nice and immediately forgotten. After dinner, as the guests moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, I slipped away to my old bedroom. It remained largely unchanged from my high school days. Debate team trophies lined the bookshelves, academic awards hung on the walls. Evidence of early excellence that had somehow never been enough. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through emails on my phone. There was a message from Eleanor confirming Monday's announcement meeting at Mitchell Reynolds and Associates. There were several from the transition team, attaching final reports on the firm's financial position, client roster, and personnel assessments. And there was one from Douglas Harrington, sent just 20 minutes ago during dinner. Olivia. Just connected the dots after some dinner research. Congratulations on the Morrison COO position. Impressive achievement. We should talk before Monday. Call me? I stared at the message, surprised. Douglas had obviously looked me up after our brief interaction and discovered my real position. He'd realized what was coming on Monday, what my father still didn't. No, that Morrison Enterprises was about to announce its acquisition of Mitchell, Reynolds, and Associates, with me as the new managing partner. I considered calling him immediately, but decided against it. Douglas was my father's colleague, recently poached from a competing firm. His loyalty should be to the partnership, not to me. The fact that he was reaching out suggested he was adept at reading political winds and adjusting his position accordingly. Useful information about his character, but not a relationship I wanted to cultivate through back channels. Instead, I texted back a professional but non-committal response. Thank you, Douglas. Happy to schedule time next week after the formal. Announcements are made. Enjoy the remainder of Thanksgiving with your family. I returned to the living room just as my father was launching into a story I'd heard countless times, how he'd built his firm from nothing, starting with just himself and a part-time paralegal in a tiny office downtown. It was a good story, one that genuinely showcased his determination and legal brilliance. It was also incomplete, omitting the advantages he'd had, family connections that brought his first major clients, a substantial loan from my grandfather, the market gap left, when a major competitor dissolved. These omissions bothered me less than they once had. Every success story is partially myth, simplified for narrative impact. What bothered me was knowing that in my father's retelling of his own legend, I would never figure as anything more than a footnote, his daughter who had chosen a corporate job over the family legacy, who had settled for being just a secretary rather than following in his illustrious footsteps. Mitchell, Reynolds, and Associates has represented some of the biggest corporate interests in this city, my father was saying, chest swelling with pride. When Morrison Enterprises needed counsel for their West Side development project last year, they came to us. You remember that case, Douglas. I nearly choked on my coffee. The West Side development project had been a disaster for Morrison, a tangle of regulatory complications, community opposition, and contractual disputes that had cost the company millions and months of delays. It was one of the reasons Eleanor had decided the company needed dedicated in-house legal counsel rather than continuing to rely on external firms. It was, in fact, the catalyst that had ultimately led to this acquisition. I do remember, Douglas said carefully, glancing my challenging situation. My father, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued. Challenging, but ultimately successful. Morrison got their approvals, didn't they? That's what matters in the end. At considerable additional cost and delay, I noted, unable to help myself. My father waved his hand dismissively. Corporate clients always focus on the bottom line, Olivia. They don't understand the complexities of regulatory law. That project was a win by any legal standard. I smiled, tightly but said nothing more. In less than 72 hours, my father would learn exactly how Morrison Enterprises viewed that win, and how it had factored into their decision to acquire his firm rather than continue as a client. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Douglas approached me again. I meant what I said in my email, he murmured. Very impressive career trajectory. Your father should be proud. Thank you, I said, genuinely appreciating his acknowledgement, though I've learned not to measure my success by my father's recognition. A valuable lesson, he replied, his expression thoughtful. One that some of us learn too late. I look forward to our conversation next week. After the last guest departed, I helped my mother clear the dessert plates while my father and Jake retreated to the study, the inner sanctum where the real Mitchell lawyers discussed cases and strategy. It was a familiar exclusion, one that had once hurt deeply, but now felt almost comical given the reality of my position. "Your father means well," my mother said softly as we loaded the dishwasher. It was her standard refrain, the peacemaker's mantra that had smoothed over countless dismissals and disappointments over the years. "I know, Mom," I replied, because it was easier than arguing. In his own way, within the narrow confines of his understanding, perhaps he did mean well. Perhaps in his mind, diminishing my corporate achievements was a form of encouragement, a way of saying I was capable of more, of real success as he defined it. "He just doesn't understand business," she continued, handing me a crystal wine glass to hand wash. "Law is all he's ever known. It's hard for him to value something outside his experience." This was new, not the excuse itself, but my mother's willingness to acknowledge my father's limitations. I looked at her more closely and saw something I hadn't noticed before, a weary resignation in her eyes, the subtle droop of her shoulders that suggested she too had grown tired of his narrow vision. "Has he told you anything about the firm's financial situation?" I asked carefully, uncertain how much she knew. She glanced toward the closed study door before answering. "Not directly. But I see the bills, Olivia. I hear the phone conversations. He thinks I don't notice. Things have been strained? Would it upset you if there were significant changes at the firm?" I asked, testing the waters. "If Dad's role were to shift?" She dried her hands slowly, considering the question. "Your father has defined himself by that firm for 30 years. Change would be difficult for him." She paused, meeting my eyes directly. "But sometimes difficult things are necessary. Sometimes they're even overdue." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In that moment, I saw my mother clearly, not as the perpetual mediator between my father and me, but as a woman who had spent decades accommodating a man whose vision had room for only one version of success. A woman who perhaps understood more than she had ever let on. "Significant changes are coming, Mom," I said quietly, "and I'm going to be part of them." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. "The promotion," she said. "It's connected to your father's firm, isn't it?" I nodded, impressed by her perceptiveness. "Morrison Enterprises has acquired a controlling interest in Mitchell, Reynolds, and Associates. I'll be overseeing the transition and serving as managing partner." She absorbed this information in silence, then surprised me by breaking into a smile, not her usual gentle, placating smile, but something fiercer, almost mischievous. "So on Monday morning, my daughter, who is just a secretary, will become her father's boss." "Essentially, yes," I admitted. She picked up another wine glass, polishing it until it gleamed. "Well," she said with quiet satisfaction, "won't that be interesting?" We finished the dishes in companionable silence, co-conspirators in a revelation that would shake my father's carefully constructed world. When we finished, I kissed her goodnight and headed upstairs, declining her suggestion that I join my father and Jake in the study. Monday would bring enough confrontation. I saw no need to seek more tonight. In my childhood bedroom, I reviewed the presentation I would deliver on Monday morning. The restructuring plan, the new management hierarchy, the vision for integrating Mitchell, Reynolds, and Associates into the Morrison Enterprises family of companies. I refined my opening remarks, choosing words that would be firm but not vindictive, authoritative but not arrogant. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about finally proving myself to a father who had consistently underestimated me. It was about business, about taking a struggling law firm with excellent attorneys and outdated practices and transforming it into something more sustainable, more innovative, more aligned with contemporary client needs. If that transformation also forced my father to recognize my capabilities, to acknowledge my expertise in the business world he had so often dismissed, well, that would simply be a secondary benefit. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, mentally, rehearsing what I would say when I finally saw the recognition dawn in my father's eyes. Not, "I told you so." I was beyond such petty triumphalism. Perhaps something more measured. "I look forward to working together in this new capacity." Professional, dignified, the kind of response that would emphasize the gulf between his perception of me and the reality of what I had become. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking not about my father's impending realization, but about all the other women who had been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated throughout their careers. The ones who had been called just something, just a secretary, just a teacher, just a nurse, just a housewife, as though these roles lacked complexity, skill, or value. Monday's revelation wouldn't just be about setting the record straight with my father. It would be about challenging a mindset that diminished not only my accomplishments, but those of countless others who had been casually relegated to the margins, of respect. With that thought, I fell asleep in my childhood bed for the last time as just a secretary in my father's eyes. When I returned for the next family gathering, everything would be different, not because I would have changed, but because his perception would finally have to align with reality. And reality, in this case, was that his dismissive attitude was about to meet its corporate reckoning. The weekend between Thanksgiving and that fateful Monday morning stretched like an eternity. I returned to my downtown apartment on Friday, politely declining my mother's invitation to stay through the weekend. "Work to prepare," I'd explained, which wasn't untrue. The Morrison-Mitchell integration would be complex, requiring careful handling to minimize disruption to clients and preserve the firm's strengths while addressing its weaknesses. But the real reason I couldn't stay was simpler. I couldn't maintain the pretense anymore. For years, I'd nodded along as my father diminished my career, swallowed my corrections when they fell on deaf ears, accepted his dismissals as an unchangeable reality of our relationship. Now, knowing what Monday would bring, that accommodation felt impossible. Better to retreat to neutral territory than risk revealing what was coming. My mother had hugged me at the door with unusual force. "Call me after," she'd whispered, a co-conspirator in the transformation about to unfold. My father had offered a distracted goodbye from his study doorway, already turning back to his conversation with Jake before I'd even stepped onto the porch. Now, Monday morning had arrived. I stood in my walk-in closet, considering my options with more care than usual. Today's outfit wasn't just professional attire, it was armor, a visual statement of authority and competence. I selected a charcoal, gray suit with subtle burgundy pinstripes, custom-tailored Italian wool with clean lines that communicated precision without ostentation. I paired it with a silk blouse in a deeper burgundy and heels that added 2 inches to my height without compromising my ability to stand comfortably through long meetings. No, just a secretary here. Every element of my appearance was designed to project the executive I had become while my father wasn't paying attention. I arrived at Mitchell, Reynolds, and Associates offices at 7:30 a.m., a full hour before the all-hands meeting scheduled to announce the acquisition. Eleanor Morrison was already there, reviewing the presentation in the main conference room. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, looking up as I entered. At 62, Eleanor radiated the confident authority that came from decades of successful leadership, her silver hair cut in a sleek bob that framed sharp, observant eyes. She had built Morrison Enterprises from a small real estate development company into a diversified corporate powerhouse, navigating recessions, market shifts, and industry transformations with remarkable adaptability. "As ready as possible," I replied, setting my briefcase on the polished mahogany table, a table I knew had been in this conference room since my father founded the firm. A piece he often mentioned had been purchased with the proceeds from his first major case victory. You know, when I realized Jonathan Mitchell was your father, I almost reconsidered this arrangement, Eleanor said, studying me carefully. Mixing family and business can be combustible. If my father had recognized my business acumen at any point in the last 6 years, that might be a valid concern, I said with a wry smile. But since he still thinks I'm a secretary, I'd say the professional relationship has ample room to develop independently of the personal one. Eleanor laughed, a short, appreciative sound. Fair point. And to be clear, this isn't why I selected you for the role. Your work as COO has been exemplary. You've streamlined our operations, identified inefficiencies I didn't even know existed, and improved our profitability across multiple divisions. The fact that you happen to have insight into the Mitchell firm culture is merely a bonus. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. In the 6 months I'd worked with Eleanor, I'd come to respect her straightforward leadership style and strategic vision. She didn't offer false praise or sugarcoat feedback, which made her genuine approval all the more valuable. The transition team has prepared individual meetings with all senior partners immediately following the announcement, I said, returning to business. We've prioritized addressing their concerns about autonomy and compensation structure. Good, Eleanor nodded. Law firms are particularly sensitive to governance changes. Lawyers tend to believe they should be running things, not being run. I'm intimately familiar with that perspective, I said dryly, thinking of my father's decades of dinner table pronouncements about how the world should operate. We spent the next 45 minutes reviewing key points and potential challenges. By 8:15, partners and associates had begun filtering into the building, curious about the unexpected all-hands meeting. By 8:25, the conference room was filling, with attorneys in well-cut suits, their expressions ranging from mildly interested to openly concerned. My father arrived at 8:28, precisely 2 minutes before the scheduled start, a habit he'd maintained throughout his career, believing that arriving exactly on time demonstrated respect without wasting precious billable minutes. He entered with Douglas Harrington at his side, deep in conversation about a pending case, and took his customary seat at the head of the table without initially registering my presence on the dais at the front of the room. When he finally looked up and saw me standing beside Eleanor, confusion flickered across his face. A brief, uncomprehending frown quickly replaced by polite acknowledgement. He clearly assumed I was there in some administrative capacity, perhaps as Eleanor's assistant. The thought that I might be central to the meeting hadn't even occurred to him. At precisely 8:30, Eleanor stepped forward. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for adjusting your schedules for this important announcement. For those who don't know me, I'm Eleanor Morrison, CEO of Morrison Enterprises. The room quieted immediately. While not everyone might recognize Eleanor on sight, her name carried significant weight in Boston business circles. As of last Wednesday, Morrison Enterprises has acquired a controlling interest in Mitchell, Reynolds and Associates, she continued without preamble. This acquisition represents an exciting opportunity for both organizations. Mitchell, Reynolds brings exceptional legal expertise and a distinguished reputation. Morrison brings capital resources, operational efficiency, and an expanded client network. I watched my father's face as Eleanor's words registered. His expression shifted from professional interest to shock, his spine stiffening as he realized what was being said. His firm, his life's work, had been acquired without his knowledge or involvement. This change in ownership structure will bring several immediate benefits, Eleanor continued smoothly. Financial stability, enhanced technology infrastructure, streamlined administrative processes, and access to Morrison's extensive client base across multiple industries. What it will not change is the core legal excellence that has defined Mitchell, Reynolds for 3 decades. My father's eyes darted around the room, taking in the reactions of his partners, many of whom appeared as surprised as he was. Douglas Harrington, however, maintained a carefully neutral expression, having had advance warning through his research after Thanksgiving dinner. To ensure a smooth transition and effective integration, we are appointing a new managing partner who will oversee the firm's operations and strategic direction while reporting directly to Morrison Enterprises' executive leadership, Eleanor said, turning toward me. Many of you may not know Olivia Mitchell, though you certainly know her father, Jonathan. All eyes in the room swiveled to me, then to my father, then back again. My father's face had gone completely still, as though any movement might shatter his carefully maintained composure. Olivia joined Morrison Enterprises 6 months ago as our chief operating officer after an impressive career at McKinsey, where she specialized in professional services optimization. Her understanding of both operational excellence and the unique culture of legal practices makes her ideally suited to lead Mitchell Reynolds into its next chapter. I'll now turn the floor over to Olivia to outline the transition plan. As I stepped forward, I met my father's gaze directly for the first time. His eyes held a complex mixture of emotions: disbelief, confusion, the beginning edges of anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify. In 32 years, I had never seen him look at me quite that way, as though seeing a stranger where his daughter should be. "Thank you, Eleanor," I began, my voice steady and assured. As Eleanor mentioned, I'm Olivia Mitchell. While some of you know me as Jonathan's daughter, today I'm speaking to you as Morrison Enterprises' COO and your new managing partner. I paused, allowing the murmurs that rippled through the room to subside. My father remained silent, his gaze never leaving my face. Let me start by acknowledging what many of you must be feeling: concern about what this acquisition means for your practice, your autonomy, and your future with the firm. Those are valid concerns that deserve straightforward answers. I proceeded to outline the transition plan, explaining the operational changes that would be implemented immediately, the technology upgrades scheduled for the first quarter, and the expanded client opportunities that would become available through Morrison's network. I detailed the new compensation structure, which preserved the partner profit-sharing model, while introducing performance metrics focused on client satisfaction rather than solely billable hours. Throughout my presentation, I maintained direct eye contact with partners around the room, including my father. I spoke with the authority that came from intimate knowledge of both organizations and a clear vision for their integration. Not once did I apologize or qualify my expertise, a habit many women develop in male-dominated environments. I owned the room because I had earned the right to do so, regardless of my father's long-standing dismissal of my capabilities. When I concluded the formal presentation, I opened the floor for questions. Several hands rose immediately. "Robert Fisher, Tax Division," said a silver-haired partner near the middle of the table. "Can you clarify how practice area leadership will be determined under the new structure? Will existing department heads retain their positions?" "Excellent question," I responded. "Existing practice leaders will maintain their roles through the initial 90-day transition period, after which we'll conduct comprehensive performance reviews. Those who demonstrate both legal expertise and alignment with our new operational approach will absolutely continue in leadership positions. This isn't about wholesale replacement, but strategic optimization." Another hand rose. "Melissa Kendrick, Family Law. Will Morrison be directing us to prioritize certain types of cases or clients over others? Many of us chose Mitchell because of its commitment to maintaining a diverse practice that includes pro bono and community service work." "The Morrison philosophy aligns perfectly with that approach," I assured her. "We believe that community engagement enhances firm reputation and attorney satisfaction, which ultimately benefits the bottom line. The pro bono program will not only continue but expand, with dedicated administrative support to maximize impact while minimizing burden on attorneys." Questions continued for nearly 30 minutes, covering everything from office locations to IT systems to client conflicts. I answered each with detailed knowledge and clear direction, occasionally deferring to Eleanor for Morrison's specific policies, but otherwise demonstrating complete command of the integration strategy. My father remained silent throughout, his expression gradually shifting from shock to a careful neutrality that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Only those who knew him well, as I certainly did, would recognize the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled tightly controlled anger. As the session concluded, I addressed the room one final time. Individual meetings with senior partners will begin at 10 a.m. as listed in the schedule being distributed now. In the meantime, please review the transition materials provided in your packets. My door is open for any additional questions or concerns. As people began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, my father finally rose from his seat. He buttoned his suit jacket in a deliberate motion, a gesture I'd seen countless times before difficult conversations in court, and approached the dais where Eleanor and I stood. "Ms. Morrison," he said with formal courtesy, extending his hand. "I believe we met briefly during the West Side development negotiations. Might I have a word with my daughter? Privately?" Eleanor glanced at me, one eyebrow slightly raised in question. I nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she replied. "I have calls to make before our next meeting. Olivia, I'll see you at 11 for the executive committee introduction." As Eleanor departed, my father turned to me, his expression now openly challenging. "My office, please." It wasn't a request but a command, the tone of a man accustomed to automatic deference. 6 months ago, even 6 days ago, I might have complied reflexively, falling into the familiar dynamic of the daughter seeking approval. Today, I met his gaze steadily. "Let's use the managing partner's office," I countered. "It's more appropriate for this discussion." His eyes flashed with irritation, but he nodded stiffly and followed as I led the way through the firm's corridors to the corner office that had been his for 3 decades. Staff members watched our progress with poorly concealed curiosity, no doubt already processing the implications of the morning's announcement. The managing partner's office, my father's office until approximately 20 minutes ago, was exactly as I remembered it from my infrequent visits over the years. Dark walnut bookshelves lined with legal volumes and industry awards. A massive desk positioned to command the room, facing the door so that anyone entering immediately felt the psychological impact of approaching the seat of authority. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Boston Harbor, a daily reminder of the premium real estate the firm occupied. My father closed the door behind us with careful control, then turned to face me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I allowed the silence to stretch, knowing from countless negotiations that the first person to break often conceded psychological advantage. "When were you planning to tell me?" he finally asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "About the acquisition or about my role in it?" I replied calmly. "Either. Both." His hand made a sharp, dismissive gesture. "You sat at my table on Thanksgiving and said nothing while I spoke about the firm to Douglas, a man who apparently knew more about my daughter's career than I did. Would you have listened if I had tried to correct your assumptions?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my tone. For 6 years, I've attempted to explain my actual role in the business world. For 6 years, you've consistently reduced it to just a secretary, regardless of evidence to the contrary. He flinched slightly at the quotation of his own words. "That's not fair, Olivia. I've always supported your choices, even when they diverged from the family tradition." "No," I interrupted firmly. "You've tolerated my choices while making it abundantly clear you found them disappointing. There's a significant difference." He moved to take his customary seat behind the desk, then hesitated, the new reality of our positions suddenly apparent. Instead, he chose one of the client chairs facing the desk, lowering himself into it with deliberate dignity. "So, this is what?" he asked after another silence. "Revenge for perceived slights? A daughter's rebellion against her father's expectations?" "This is business," I replied, remaining standing rather than taking the seat that was now legitimately mine. Morrison Enterprises needed dedicated legal counsel integrated into our corporate structure. Mitchell, Reynolds needed capital infusion and operational modernization to remain competitive in a changing market. The synergy was obvious from a strategic perspective. And the fact that it places you in authority over me? Was that merely coincidental? His skepticism was evident. The fact that I am uniquely qualified to understand both Morrison's corporate needs and Mitchell's legal culture made me the optimal choice for managing the integration, I said. Would I have been selected for this role if I weren't exceedingly good at what I do? No. Did my familiarity with the firm's founding partner factor into the final decision? Probably. Business decisions rarely have single variables. My father studied me with new eyes, as though trying to reconcile the composed executive before him with the daughter he thought he knew. "Your mother knew," he said suddenly. "She wasn't surprised by any of this, was she?" "I told her on Thanksgiving night," I admitted. "After you and Jake retreated to the study." He nodded slowly, processing this additional layer of realization. "I see. Do you?" I asked, softening my tone slightly. "Do you really see, Dad? Because what I need you to understand is that this isn't about you at all. This is about me, building a career based on my actual talents and interests, not on a predetermined path that might have made you proud, but would have made me miserable." "You could have been an exceptional attorney," he said, a hint of the old dismissal returning. "Top of your class at Stanford, perfect LSAT scores. You had every advantage." "I would have been a mediocre attorney at best," I corrected him. "Because I have no passion for law. What I do have is a gift for systems, for seeing inefficiencies and remedying them, for building operational frameworks that allow talented specialists to do their best work without administrative friction. That's not something to be dismissed as just anything. It's a skill set that has built my career and, incidentally, will now save your firm." He looked up sharply. "Save it? Mitchell, Reynolds doesn't need saving. We're one of the most respected firms in Boston." "Respect doesn't pay the bills, Dad. The firm has been operating at a loss for the past 3 quarters. Your lease on this premium office space is up for renewal at significantly increased rates. Your technology infrastructure is a decade behind industry standards, costing you thousands in wasted attorney hours. And your client acquisition rate has dropped 15% year over year as younger corporate counsel seek firms with more modern approaches." Each fact landed like a physical blow. I wasn't sharing anything he didn't already know on some level, but hearing it articulated so clearly, by his daughter no less, forced a confrontation with reality he had been avoiding. "How do you know all this?" he asked quietly. "Due diligence," I replied. Morrison's acquisition team conducted a thorough analysis before making the offer. The firm's finances are concerning but not terminal. With proper operational guidance and capital investment, Mitchell, Reynolds can return to profitability within 18 months. That's the business case for this acquisition. My father sat back in the chair, suddenly looking older than his 63 years. For the first time in my adult life, I saw uncertainty in his expression, the foundation of his professional identity shifting beneath him. "What happens to me in this new structure?" he asked finally. "That depends largely on you," I said. "Honestly, your legal expertise remains valuable. Your client relationships are significant assets. You could continue as a senior partner focused on high-value cases, freed from the administrative burdens that have increasingly consumed your time, or—" I paused, considering whether to voice the alternative. "Or?" he prompted. Or you could choose to see this as an opportunity to mentor the next generation of attorneys while gradually transitioning toward retirement. Eleanor and I have discussed creating an emeritus position that would preserve your status and income while reducing your workload. He absorbed this in silence, his expression unreadable. Then, with the resilience that had defined his career, he straightened in his chair. "I'm not ready for emeritus status," he said firmly, "and I have questions about this integration plan. Your presentation glossed over several key operational details that could significantly impact our practice areas." I felt a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. This was the Jonathan Mitchell I knew. Never down for long, always ready to engage with the substance of a challenge. "Your individual meeting is scheduled for 10:30, I said. "Bring your questions. I'll have answers." He stood, adjusting his tie with habitual precision. "I've underestimated you," he said, the admission clearly difficult for him. "That won't happen again." "Good," I replied simply. "Because Mitchell, Reynolds deserves the full benefit of both our talents, working in alignment rather than at cross purposes." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "Does Jake know?" "No," I said. "I thought that." "Conversation should come from you." He nodded, accepting this small consideration. "Olivia," he said, using my full name rather than the diminutive Liv he had favored since my childhood. "You really are the COO of Morrison Enterprises?" "I really am," I confirmed. "C-suite position, equity stake, executive board seat. Everything you dismissed as administrative support is actually strategic leadership." He shook his head slightly, more at himself than at me. "I'll see you at 10:30 then." As the door closed behind him, I moved behind the desk and sat in the chair that had been his for 30 years, the seat from which he had directed the firm, Mentored Associates, built his reputation as one of Boston's premier attorneys. Leather was worn in places that matched his frame, shaped by decades of his presence. I ran my hands along the smooth wood of the desk surface, taking in the view of the harbor from this new perspective. This wasn't triumph, or at least, not merely triumph, it was responsibility. The lives and careers of everyone at Mitchell, Reynolds now depended in part on my leadership, my vision, my ability to navigate the complex integration ahead. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "How did it go?" I replied with simple honesty. "Challenging but necessary. He's processing." Her response came quickly. "Having dinner with both my C-suite executives tonight. 7 p.m., don't be late." I smiled at the screen, appreciating her immediate acknowledgement of the new reality. Then, I set the phone aside and turned to the transition materials spread before me. The real work was just beginning. The revelation had occurred. The recognition, however, reluctant, had been achieved. Now came the far more difficult task of proving day after day, meeting after meeting, decision after decision, that I deserved not just my father's belated respect, but the trust of an entire firm that was now under my leadership. Being dismissed as just a secretary had been frustrating. Being recognized as a capable executive would be validating. But being an effective leader who transformed Mitchell Reynolds while healing the professional breach with my father, that would be the real victory, one that transcended personal vindication to create lasting value. I picked up the phone on my desk now, and pressed the intercom. "Please ask Douglas Harrington to come in before his scheduled meeting time. I'd like to speak with him first." If I was going to lead this firm effectively, I needed to understand its internal dynamics from multiple perspectives, starting with the partner who had recognized my true position before anyone else. The game had changed, and I was now setting the rules. Douglas Harrington arrived at my office exactly 7 minutes after my summons, enough time to appear responsive without seeming overeager. His tailored navy suit and carefully neutral expression spoke of a man accustomed to navigating complex, professional situations with measured precision. "Olivia," he said, closing the door behind him. Or should I say, Ms. Mitchell now? Olivia is fine, Douglas, I replied, gesturing toward the chair my father had vacated. Please have a seat. He settled into the chair with practiced ease, his posture attentive but relaxed. Impressive presentation this morning. Not many executives could announce such a significant organizational change with that level of authority, particularly when facing a room full of attorneys predisposed to challenge every assertion. Thank you, I acknowledged, recognizing the compliment as genuine despite its careful delivery. Though I suspect you weren't as surprised as the rest of the room, given your message after Thanksgiving dinner. A slight smile crossed his face. I make it a habit to research people I meet in professional contexts. When your father introduced you as a secretary at Morrison, the disconnect was too significant to ignore. A simple LinkedIn search revealed the truth. And you chose to reach out rather than mention your discovery to my father, I observed. An interesting decision. Professional courtesy, he replied smoothly. It wasn't my place to correct your father's misperceptions, especially in a social setting, but it seemed prudent to establish direct contact with Morrison's COO before today's announcement. I studied him thoughtfully. Douglas had joined Mitchell, Reynolds only 4 months ago, recruited from Harrington, Patel and Associates, a smaller but well-regarded firm specializing in corporate restructuring. My father had mentioned the recruitment as a significant win, though I now wondered about the timing. When did you know about the acquisition? I asked directly. He met my gaze without hesitation. I had my suspicions when Morrison's outside. Counsel began requesting unusual levels of documentation about our client base and operational structure. Those suspicions grew when your name appeared on Morrison's executive leadership page shortly after. The connection seemed too coincidental to ignore. So you positioned yourself accordingly, I noted. Joining a firm you suspected might soon be acquired by a major corporation. I positioned myself where my skills would be most valuable, he corrected gently. Mitchell, Reynolds has an excellent reputation and client base but outdated management practices. Given my background in corporate restructuring, the opportunity to help navigate what I suspected would be a significant transition was professionally appealing. His answer was diplomatic yet honest, acknowledging the strategic element of vow, his decision without framing it as opportunistic. I found myself appreciating his directness. And now that the transition is confirmed? I asked. Now I'm hoping to be an asset to that transition, he replied. I have no long-standing allegiances or entrenched habits within the firm. I understand both legal practice and corporate operational requirements, and I'm comfortable with change, in ways that many of your father's contemporaries may not be. I nodded slowly, considering his implicit offer. The integration team will need partners who can help bridge the cultural gap between traditional legal practice and corporate efficiency models. Your background makes you well-suited for such a role. Precisely my thinking, he confirmed. However, I continued, I need to be certain where your loyalties lie. This morning you watched me effectively demote my own father while upending the power structure of a firm he built over 3 decades. That creates a complex dynamic. Douglas leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. My loyalty is to excellence and innovation, Olivia. Your father built something remarkable for its time, but times change. Legal practices that fail to evolve will ultimately fail their clients and their attorneys. I joined Mitchell Reynolds because I saw potential for evolution. If Morrison Enterprises and your leadership are the catalysts for that evolution, then my professional interests align perfectly with your vision. It was a good answer. Perhaps too good, too carefully calibrated to what I wanted to hear. But professional relationships aren't built on perfect trust. They're built on aligned interests and demonstrated reliability over time. I'm forming a transition committee of 5 partners to help implement the integration plan, I said, making a decision. I'd like you to serve as one of those partners, focusing specifically on restructuring the firm's client engagement model to align with Morrison's more consultative approach. "I'd be honored," he replied, his expression revealing genuine pleasure at the opportunity. "Though I should warn you that some of the more traditional partners may see my involvement as confirming suspicions that I was somehow complicit in the acquisition." "Let them," I said with a slight shrug. "Their suspicion of you is less problematic than their potential resistance to necessary changes. Better to channel that resistance toward you than toward the entire integration process." He laughed softly, appreciating the strategic calculation. "Using me as a lightning rod. Efficient." "I prefer to think of it as appropriate resource allocation," I countered with a small smile. "Your recent arrival makes you an easy target for displaced frustration, but also positions you perfectly to absorb it without the personal investment that longer-tenured partners might feel." "Fair assessment," he conceded. "And my scheduled meeting? Should we proceed with that now, or—" "We've covered the essentials," I said, glancing at my watch. "The formal meeting would be redundant. I have your transition committee assignment scheduled to be announced this afternoon, along with the other appointees." As Douglas rose to leave, he paused. "May I offer an observation, Olivia?" Speaking. "Now, as someone who has navigated numerous corporate transitions," I nodded, curious. "The most challenging aspect of your position won't be the operational changes. Those are straightforward, if sometimes painful. It will be balancing your professional authority with the personal dynamics, particularly with your father." His expression was thoughtful, almost sympathetic. He's built his identity around this firm and his position within it. Redefining that identity will require more than organizational charts and strategic plans. "I'm aware of the complexity," I acknowledged, appreciating his insight. "I don't doubt it," he replied. "But awareness and preparation are different things. Just be prepared for the personal cost of this transition. Professional victories often come with unexpected emotional complications." After Douglas left, I found myself reflecting on his parting observation. The morning had been consumed with the mechanics of the announcement, the presentation, the questions, the initial confrontation with my father. I'd prepared extensively for those elements, anticipating reactions and planning responses. But the longer-term personal implications remained largely uncharted territory. My intercom buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. "Ms. Mitchell, your 10:30 is here." My father, right on time as always. "Send him in," I replied. He entered with the same commanding presence he'd always brought to every room, though now tempered with a new wariness. He carried a leather portfolio filled with what I assumed were his questions about the integration plan, professionally prepared despite the personal shock he must still be processing. "Olivia," he said with formal courtesy, taking the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. "I've reviewed the transition materials, and," I prompted when he didn't immediately continue. "And I have concerns," he replied, opening his portfolio to reveal several pages of neatly organized notes, beginning with the proposed realignment of practice areas. "Consolidating corporate litigation with general business services undermines the specialized expertise we've developed in securities litigation specifically." I nodded, appreciating his focus on substantive issues rather than personal grievances. "That's a valid concern, and one we're willing to reconsider. The initial proposal was based on Morrison's corporate structure, but we're open to preserving specializations that represent competitive advantages." For the next 45 minutes, we engaged in a detailed discussion of the integration plan. My father raising thoughtful questions about everything from client transition protocols to partner compensation adjustments, me providing substantive responses while noting areas where his insight suggested potential refinements to our approach. It was the most productive professional conversation we'd ever had. There was no condescension in his manner, no dismissal of my expertise. He engaged with me as he would any respected executive, challenging where appropriate, acknowledging valid points, focusing on objectives rather than egos. As our scheduled time drew to a close, he closed his portfolio and fixed me with a direct gaze. "You're well prepared," he said, a simple acknowledgement that nonetheless represented a significant shift in his perception, more so than I would have expected. "I've had 6 months at Morrison learning their operations, and 32 years observing yours," I replied. "My preparation didn't begin yesterday." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps regret, crossed his face. "No, I suppose it didn't." He hesitated, then added, "Your mother says you're having dinner at the house tonight." "She invited me, yes." "Good," he nodded. "We should continue our discussion in a less formal setting." It wasn't quite an olive branch, but it was an acknowledgement that our relationship now extended beyond the professional dynamics we'd just navigated. Progress, however incremental. The remainder of the day unfolded in a carefully choreographed sequence of partner meetings, team introductions, and operational briefings. I moved through these interactions with focused efficiency, establishing my authority not through asserting position, but through demonstrating competence, answering questions directly, making decisions clearly, showing genuine interest in preserving what worked while improving what didn't. By late afternoon, the initial shock of the announcement had given way to a cautious pragmatism among most partners. There were exceptions, of course. 2 senior partners made their resistance plainly evident, questioning every aspect of the PSI integration plan with barely concealed hostility. I noted their objections respectfully but firmly maintained direction, neither antagonizing nor appeasing them. At 5:45 p.m., as I was reviewing notes from the day's meetings, my mother texted, "Dinner at 7, Jake will be there too. Warned him to be on best behavior." I smiled slightly at the phone screen, appreciating my mother's clear positioning. Her message conveyed not just logistics, but alignment. She was preparing the family environment just as carefully as I had, prepared the professional one. I arrived at my parents' home at 6:55 p.m., deliberately early to have a moment with my mother before my father and Jake arrived. She met me at the door with a warm embrace. "The returning conqueror," she said with a hint of teasing pride as she ushered me inside. "Hardly a conquest, Mom," I demurred. "Just a business integration." She hummed noncommittally, leading me toward the kitchen where delicious aromas suggested she'd prepared my favorite pasta. "And how did the business integration go with your father this morning?" "Better than expected," I admitted. "He's processing the change professionally, focusing on substantive issues rather than personal dynamics." "That's his way," she nodded, stirring the sauce simmering on the stove. "Jonathan retreats to professional competence when emotional terrain becomes unfamiliar. It's why he's an excellent attorney and a sometimes challenging father." Her insight struck me as both accurate and surprisingly candid. My mother had always played the diplomatic peacemaker between my father and me, smoothing over his dismissals and my reactions with practiced social grace. This more direct acknowledgement of his limitations represented a shift in her own positioning. "You're different today," I observed. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Am I? Or am I simply free to be more fully myself now that's certain? Imbalances have been addressed?" Before I could respond to this intriguing suggestion, the front door opened, and my father's voice called out, "Elizabeth?" "We're home." My mother squeezed my hand briefly. "Let me handle Jake," she murmured. "He was quite upset after your father called him this afternoon." Jake entered the kitchen first, his expression a mixture of confusion and resentment when he saw me. At 25, my brother had always been the anointed heir to the Mitchell legal legacy, groomed, mentored, and celebrated for following the path our father had designated before he was even born. "So it's true," he said without preamble. "You've taken over Dad's firm." Morrison Enterprises has acquired a controlling interest in Mitchell, Reynolds, and I'm managing the integration as the new managing partner, I corrected gently. It's a business transaction, Jake, not a palace coup. My father appeared behind him, placing a restraining hand on his shoulder. Let's discuss this civilly over dinner, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Your mother has gone to considerable effort. Dinner began with tense silence, broken only by my mother's deliberate small talk about the weather and an upcoming charity event. I followed her lead, responding with appropriate interest while giving my father and brother space to adjust to the new dynamic. Finally, after serving the main course, my mother addressed the elephant in the room. Jake, I understand today's news came as a shock, but I expect you to show your sister the same professional courtesy you would any business executive. Her accomplishments deserve respect, not resentment. Jake flushed, pushing pasta around his plate. I just don't understand why she never said anything. Sitting here at Thanksgiving, letting Dad talk about the firm while knowing all along. Would you have believed me? I asked quietly. If I had announced over turkey that I was Morrison's COO and about to become Dad's boss, would you have taken that seriously? Or would you have assumed I was exaggerating my position, as Dad has consistently done for years? My brother had the grace to look uncomfortable. You could have tried. I have tried, Jake. For 6 years I've corrected, clarified, and explained my actual career progression. It never mattered. The narrative in this family has always been that law is the only profession worthy of respect, and anyone choosing a different path is somehow settling for less. My father set down his fork with deliberate care. That's not entirely fair, Olivia. Isn't it? I met his gaze directly. When was the last time you described my career accurately to anyone? When have you ever spoken about my work with the same pride you show when discussing Jake's law school performance? A heavy silence fell over the table. My father looked genuinely taken aback, as though this perspective had never occurred to him. Your sister is right, my mother said softly, surprising us all. We've been unfair in how we've valued your different paths. Not intentionally, perhaps, but consistently. Mom, Jake began, but she raised a hand to stop him. Let me finish, Jacob. For 30 years, I've watched your father build his identity around legal practice, around a very specific definition of professional success. I've supported that vision because it made him happy and because it aligned with his genuine talents. But somewhere along the way, that personal preference became a family doctrine. The unquestioned assumption that the law was inherently superior to other professional pursuits. My father stared at her, clearly surprised by this frank assessment, from the woman who had always been his most steadfast supporter. When Olivia chose a different path, my mother continued, we failed to recognize that she was following the same principle your father did, pursuing work that aligned with her natural gifts. The only difference was the field, not the dedication, or the excellence. I never meant to dismiss your choices, Olivia, my father said quietly. I simply didn't understand them. Law has been my world for so long that I struggle to properly value work in other domains. I know, Dad, I acknowledged, feeling some of my own defensive tension ease. And I didn't come to dinner tonight to extract apologies or assign blame. What's done is done. What matters now is how we move forward, both professionally and as a family. Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. So what happens to the firm now? To Dad's position? To my future there after graduation? A practical question, cutting to the heart of his immediate concerns. Typical Jake, always focused on the direct implications for his planned trajectory. The firm will continue operating under the Mitchell Reynolds name as a subsidiary of Morrison Enterprises, I explained. Dad will remain a senior partner, focusing on high-value cases without the administrative burden he's carried for years. And your position after graduation remains secure, assuming you still want to join, knowing the organizational structure has changed. Of course I still want to join, he said, looking mildly offended at the suggestion. It's still Dad's firm, even if the ownership has changed. I exchanged a brief glance with my father, recognizing his influence in Jake's perspective. The firm had never simply been Dad's firm. It had partners, associates, a complex governance structure. But in our family narrative, it had always been presented as a singular achievement, a personal kingdom rather than a collaborative enterprise. It's more accurate to say it's still the same firm with the same core values, I corrected gently. The ownership change brings new resources and operational approaches, but the legal excellence remains the foundation. If anything, you'll be joining a more stable, forward-looking organization than would have been possible under the previous structure. My father nodded slowly. Your sister is right, Jake. The firm has been facing significant challenges that the Morrison acquisition helps address. This change, while unexpected in its specific form, was becoming necessary one way or another. It was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement he had yet made of the firm's financial reality, and the first time he had explicitly supported my perspective in front of Jake. The shift in his positioning was subtle, but unmistakable. So you're okay with this, Dad? Jake asked, clearly struggling to reconcile his father's apparent acceptance with his own sense of disruption. My father considered the question carefully before answering. I'm adjusting to it, he said finally. It's not the future I had envisioned for the firm, but I'm beginning to see that Olivia's approach may preserve what matters most while addressing problems I've been reluctant to confront. It wasn't unqualified enthusiasm, but it was honest and far more supportive than I had anticipated at this early stage. Something had shifted in him between our morning confrontation and this dinner conversation. Some recognition had taken root that allowed him to see beyond the personal challenge to his authority and consider the substantive merits of the change. I spent today in partner meetings, he continued, addressing me directly now. Heard their reactions to your presentation, their questions about the integration plan. Many were impressed, Olivia. Not just with the Morrison resources, but with your command of both the legal and operational aspects. Douglas Harrington in particular spoke highly of your strategic vision. Douglas only joined the firm 4 months ago, Jake pointed out. He hardly represents the old guard. Perhaps that's precisely why his perspective matters, my mother interjected. He sees the situation with fresh eyes, without decades of attachment to the status quo. As the conversation continued, I observed a gradual warming in the atmosphere. Not complete acceptance, particularly from Jake, but an emerging willingness to engage with the new reality rather than simply resist it. By dessert, we had moved from tense confrontation to something approaching normal family dinner conversation, albeit with an undercurrent of ongoing adjustment. When the evening concluded, my father walked me to my car while my mother and Jake cleared the dessert dishes. The November air was crisp, our breath forming small clouds in the darkness. I underestimated you, he said quietly as we reached my car. Not just professionally, though that's certainly true. I underestimated your resilience, your strategic thinking, your willingness to forge your own path despite my disapproval. I learned those qualities from you, Dad, I replied, surprising myself with the realization as I said it. Your determination, your strategic mind, your belief in your own judgment. Those are the traits that made you successful in law. I simply applied them in a different arena. He considered this, his expression thoughtful in the glow of the street lamp. Perhaps that's what I failed to see, how much of me exists in your chosen path, despite its difference from mine. He hesitated, then added, I'm proud of you, Olivia, not because you've achieved a position of authority over me, but because you've built something substantial on your own terms. The words I had waited years to hear, acknowledgement not just of my success, but of the legitimacy of my chosen path. They affected me more deeply than I had anticipated, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with professional validation and everything to do with the father-daughter relationship that had always existed beneath our professional differences. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing he would understand the weight of those two words. As I drove away from my childhood home, I reflected on the day's journey, from the shock of the morning announcement to this moment of genuine connection with my father. The transition was far from complete, both professionally and personally. There would be difficult days ahead as we navigated the complex integration of two organizational cultures and the equally complex recalibration of our family dynamics. But something fundamental had shifted. The dismissal that had defined our relationship for years, the casual diminishment of my work as just administrative, had been replaced by recognition, however belated. Not just recognition of title or position, but of capability, of strategic vision, of professional worth. I had entered Morrison Enterprises 6 months ago seeking professional growth and meaningful work. I hadn't anticipated that the path would lead me back to my father's firm, to a confrontation with the patterns of dismissal that had shaped our relationship for years. Yet here I was, navigating a business integration that was simultaneously healing a personal breach, creating value, not just for shareholders and clients, but for the family relationships that had seemed permanently constrained by misunderstanding. Sometimes the most powerful change isn't achieving external validation, but transforming how we allow others to define our worth. My father would never again see me as just a secretary, not because I had proven him wrong through position or power, but because I had finally broken through the narrative constraints that had limited his perception of my capabilities. And in that transformation lay a lesson more valuable than any professional achievement. True respect isn't commanded or demanded. It's earned through consistent excellence that eventually becomes impossible to dismiss, even by those most invested in maintaining their limiting perceptions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, resistant partners to persuade, operational changes to implement, a brother still struggling to adjust to the new reality. But tonight, driving through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood toward my downtown apartment, I felt a quiet confidence that I was equipped for whatever came next. Not because I was now my father's boss, but because I had finally become fully myself. Recognized not just for what I did, but for who I was, on my own terms. And that recognition, beginning with my father but ultimately extending to myself, was the most significant adjustment of all. The honeymoon phase of any major organizational change typically lasts about 3 days. By day 4, the initial shock has worn off, the polite acceptance has faded, and the real resistance begins to emerge. Mitchell, Reynolds proved no exception to this pattern. 1 week after the acquisition announcement, I arrived at the office to find a message from my assistant. Emergency meeting called by Senior Partners Group in Conference Room B, 9 a.m. The fact that I hadn't been formally notified, merely informed after the fact, spoke volumes about the nature of this emergency. I glanced at my watch, 8:47 a.m., perfect timing for them to gather and build collective momentum before I could intervene. A classic resistance tactic, one I'd seen countless times during organizational transformations at McKinsey. I considered my options quickly, burst in immediately and risk appearing defensive, arrive exactly on time and potentially face a united front, or arrive strategically late to disrupt their rhythm. I chose option 4. At 8:50 a.m., I called Douglas Harrington. "Douglas, are you aware of the senior partners meeting happening right now in Conference Room B?" "I am," he confirmed, his tone carefully neutral. "I received an email from Gerald Winthrop late last night, rather pointed language about preserving the firm's core values and addressing concerning developments in the integration process." Gerald Winthrop, my father's closest colleague and friend for over 25 years, head of litigation, and the most traditionally minded of the senior partners. His resistance was expected, though the speed of his mobilization was impressive. "And you're attending?" I asked. I thought it might be valuable to have eyes and ears in the room, he replied diplomatically. Indeed. Would you be willing to record and stream the meeting to me? Privately, of course. There was a brief pause. That would be unorthodox, he said carefully, neither accepting nor refusing outright. So is calling an emergency partners. Meeting without notifying the managing partner, I countered. I'd prefer to understand the exact nature of their concerns before responding. Another pause, longer this time. I can leave my tablet running with the conference app open, he finally offered. Audio only, placed in my briefcase. Would that suffice? Perfectly, I replied. Call my private line when you're set up. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. Douglas had positioned his tablet strategically, allowing me to hear the conversation. Already underway in Conference Room B, Gerald Winthrop's distinctive baritone dominated the audio. Unprecedented in the firm's history. Decisions about practice area realignment being made without proper partner consultation. Staff reassignments happening without departmental approval. And this morning I discovered the Morrison HR team has begun evaluating our compensation structure, including partner distributions that were established in our founding charter. Murmurs of agreement followed this recitation of grievances. I recognized several voices: Richard Thornton from the tax division, Elaine Woodward from estate planning, Benjamin Clark from corporate. The question, Gerald continued, is how we respond. We remain majority stakeholders in our practice areas, regardless of the corporate ownership structure. If we present a united front against these changes, Morrison will have to reconsider their approach. Have you spoken with Jonathan about this? Asked a voice I identified as Margaret Reeves, one of the more moderate senior partners. Jonathan is conflicted, Gerald replied carefully. His daughter's position complicates his ability to take a firm stand. I've kept him informed, but thought it best not to involve him directly in this initial discussion. Interesting that Gerald would position my father as conflicted rather than aligned with the resistance. Either he wasn't confident of my father's support, or he was strategically keeping my father insulated from potential fallout. Either way, it revealed uncertainty about where my father truly stood. What about the other partners? This was Benjamin, Clark's voice. We're only 8 people in this room out of 22 partners total. The younger partners lack the institutional history to fully grasp what's at stake, Gerald dismissed. Many of them seem quite taken with Morrison's promises of technology upgrades and expanded client access. And Douglas? Margaret again. He's not here. Harrington is a recent addition with ties to the corporate restructuring world, Gerald said, his tone suggesting this was explanation enough. His loyalty to the firm's traditional values is uncertain. At that moment, I heard the conference room door open and Douglas's voice cut clearly through the audio. My apologies for the delay. Traffic was unusually heavy this morning. A brief, awkward silence followed before Gerald resumed, his tone noticeably more guarded. We were just discussing concerns about the pace and direction of the Morrison integration. Yes, I gathered from your email, Douglas replied evenly, though I'm curious why this meeting wasn't scheduled through the standard channels. Ms. Mitchell's calendar shows no record of this discussion. This is a senior partners matter, Gerald stated firmly, predating any Morrison involvement. I see, Douglas said, his tone neutral but pointed. And Jonathan Mitchell? As founding partner, surely his perspective would be valuable. Another silence. I could almost picture Gerald shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Jonathan is aware of our concerns, he finally said. But given his unique situation, we thought it best to formulate our position independently before bringing him into the discussion. Unique situation meaning his daughter is now managing partner, Douglas clarified, bringing the subtext directly into the open. A fact that everyone in this room has been dancing around since we began. I smiled slightly at his directness. Douglas was proving to be a valuable ally, willing to address the underlying dynamics that others preferred to leave unspoken. The personal relationship is irrelevant, Gerald insisted. What matters is preserving the autonomy and culture that have made Mitchell Reynolds successful for 3 decades. I don't disagree with the objective, Douglas replied, but I question whether resistance is the most effective strategy. The acquisition is complete. The integration is underway. The question isn't whether changes will happen, but how we shape them to preserve what truly matters while embracing necessary modernization. Modernization, Gerald repeated with audible skepticism. A convenient euphemism for dismantling. Established practices that have served us well for years. Have they? Douglas challenged. Our profit margins have declined for 6 consecutive quarters. Associate retention has dropped 30% in 2 years. Our technology platform is so outdated that new hires require specialized training just to use our document management system. Are these the established practices you're so eager to preserve? The room fell silent. Douglas had just publicly articulated the firm's vulnerabilities, facts that the senior partners undoubtedly knew but preferred not to acknowledge directly. Having heard enough to understand their position, I ended the call and headed toward I. Conference Room B. It was time to address the resistance directly rather than through surveillance. I entered without knocking, the door swinging open to reveal 8 senior partners seated around the conference table, their expressions shifting from surprise to varying degrees of discomfort as they registered my presence. Douglas sat at the far end, his face revealing nothing as our eyes briefly met. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, closing the door behind me. "I understand there are concerns about the integration process that warranted an emergency meeting. I'd appreciate being included in such discussions going forward." Gerald Winthrop recovered first, straightening in his chair. "Olivia, Ms. Mitchell, this was an internal senior partners discussion about resistant strategies to the Morrison integration," I completed for him. "About preserving autonomy and traditional practices. About presenting a united front against changes you find threatening." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem remarkably well informed about a meeting you weren't invited to." "I make it my business to be well informed," I replied calmly, taking an empty seat at the table. "Just as I make it my business to understand the firm's financial position, operational inefficiencies, and competitive vulnerabilities, all of which necessitated this acquisition in the first place." "The acquisition may have been necessary," Richard Thornton interjected, "but the implementation approach seems unnecessarily aggressive. Practices are being reorganized without consultation with the very partners who built them." I turned to face him directly. "Richard, your tax practice has operated at a loss for the past 3 quarters, subsidized by corporate and litigation. Your client acquisition rate has fallen 23% year over year, and your 2 most promising associates have accepted offers at competing firms. What would you suggest we consult you about? How to continue these trends, or how to reverse them?" His face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That's an unfair characterization." "It's an accurate characterization," I corrected firmly. "One documented in the due diligence reports that informed this acquisition. I've personally reviewed the performance metrics for every practice area in this firm, which is why the integration plan prioritizes addressing the most critical operational weaknesses first." I looked around the table, meeting each partner's gaze directly. "Let me be absolutely clear. Mitchell, Reynolds is being integrated into Morrison Enterprises because it has tremendous potential value, exceptional legal talent, prestigious client relationships, a respected brand. But that potential is currently undermined by outdated systems, inefficient processes, and resistance to necessary evolution. My job is to preserve what works while fixing what doesn't." "And who determines what works?" Gerald challenged. "Corporate efficiency metrics that have nothing to do with legal excellence?" Results determine what works, I replied evenly. Client retention, revenue growth, talent acquisition and development. By those measures that matter in any professional services business, several of your traditional practices are demonstrably failing. The room fell silent as this statement settled over the group. It was direct, perhaps uncomfortably, so but necessary to shift the conversation from emotional resistance to factual reality. What exactly do you want from us, Olivia? Margaret Reeves asked finally, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than hostility. I want your expertise, not your obstruction, I answered honestly. Each of you has built valuable knowledge and client relationships over decades of practice. That's an asset we need to leverage, not an obstacle to work around. But leveraging it requires your willingness to adapt, to recognize that legal excellence alone is insufficient in today's competitive landscape. And if we're not convinced of the need to adapt as dramatically as Morrison proposes, Gerald pressed. Then you have choices to make, I said simply. You can work constructively to influence the direction of change. You can accept the changes, with professional grace even if you disagree, or you can explore opportunities elsewhere. What you cannot do is undermine the integration through coordinated resistance, while continuing to benefit from the firm's resources and reputation. This blunt articulation of their options created another weighted silence. I had essentially called their bluff, making it clear that while their expertise was valued, their cooperation was expected as a condition of continued partnership. Benjamin Clark broke the silence. You mentioned our expertise. How specifically do you see that being incorporated into the integration process, given that decisions like practice realignment seem to have been made without our input? It was a fair question, one that offered an opening for constructive engagement rather than continued confrontation. I decided to meet it with equal constructiveness. The initial integration framework was developed based on operational analysis and Morrison's previous experience with professional services acquisitions, I explained. But implementation details, including practice area configuration, remain flexible. I'm forming a partner advisory council to provide structured input on implementation decisions, with emphasis on preserving client relationships and leveraging specialized expertise. And the composition of this council? Margaret inquired. 6 partners representing different practice areas and tenure levels, I replied. I'd like 2 senior partners, 2 mid-level, and 2 junior partners, elected by their respective peer groups. The council will meet weekly with the integration team to review proposals and offer alternatives where appropriate. This proposal visibly shifted the energy in the room. By offering a structured mechanism for influence rather than merely demanding compliance, I had acknowledged their legitimate interest in shaping the firm's future while maintaining the clear direction of the integration. That seems reasonable, Margaret conceded, looking around at her colleagues. Though the devil will be in the details of how much actual influence this council would have. The council will have meaningful advisory authority, though final decisions remain with the integration team, I clarified. This isn't co-management, but it is genuine consultation. When would this council be formed? Benjamin asked, his tone suggesting growing interest in the concept. Elections could be held this week, with the first meeting scheduled for Monday, I proposed. I'll circulate a formal structure document by end of day today. As the conversation continued, focusing now on the practical aspects of the council, formation rather than resistance to the integration itself, I observed the subtle but significant shift in the group's positioning. Not complete acceptance, certainly, but movement from outright opposition toward cautious engagement, exactly the transition needed to channel their energy productively. Gerald Winthrop remained skeptical, his body language and occasional comments revealing continued resistance. But he was now isolated rather than leading the charge, his absolutist position undermined by the more moderate partner's willingness to engage with my proposal. When the meeting concluded 30 minutes later, I asked Gerald to remain behind. As the other partners filed out, several nodding respectfully in my direction, I noticed Douglas lingering by the door. "Thank you for your contribution to the discussion, Douglas," I said, making it clear he was dismissed. "Would you mind giving Gerald and me a few minutes?" He nodded and departed, closing the door behind him. Gerald and I faced each other across the now empty conference table. "That was deftly handled," he said after a moment, his tone mixing reluctant admiration with persistent wariness. "Jonathan always said you had political instincts, though he thought they were wasted outside the courtroom. My father has always had a limited view of where various skills might be valuable," I replied evenly. "But I didn't ask you to stay so we could discuss his misconceptions." "No, I imagine not." Gerald leaned back slightly, his posture deliberately casual, though. His eyes remained alert. "Why did you ask me to stay, Olivia?" "Because I need to understand whether you're capable of adaptation or committed to obstruction," I said directly. "You're influential among the senior partners. You have legitimate expertise that could benefit the firm going forward. But your positioning this morning suggests you see yourself as the guardian of a status quo that is no longer viable." He studied me for a long moment before responding. "I've been with this firm for 28 years. I helped your father build it, from a 3-attorney office to a regional powerhouse. I've mentored dozens of associates, including some who are now partners. And now I'm being told that everything we built needs to be fixed by executives who've never practiced law a day in their lives." "Not everything," I corrected. "The legal excellence remains the foundation. What needs fixing are the operational systems that support that excellence, systems that haven't evolved as the firm and the market have changed." "Systems I helped design," he pointed out. "Systems you helped design 30 years ago," I emphasized, "when document management meant physical files and client communication happened primarily through in-person meetings and formal correspondence." "The world has changed, Gerald. Our clients have changed. Their expectations have changed." He sighed, some of the defensive tension leaving his shoulders. "I'm not blind to the challenges, Olivia. I've seen the financial reports. I know we've lost ground to more technologically advanced competitors. But there's a difference between evolution and revolution, and this integration feels decidedly like the latter. Revolutions happen when evolution is resisted past the breaking point," I observed. Had Mitchell, Reynolds embraced gradual modernization years ago, this more dramatic intervention wouldn't be necessary now. Gerald couldn't argue with this reality, and his silence acknowledged as much. After a moment, he asked, "What exactly are you offering me?" "A seat on this partner advisory council." "More than that," I replied. "I'm offering you the opportunity to be a bridge rather than a barrier. The senior partners respect you. Many associates view you as a mentor. Your support for necessary changes, even qualified support, would ease the transition for everyone. And if I'm not convinced all these changes are necessary, then challenge them specifically and constructively," I said. "Bring alternatives, not just objections. My goal isn't to dismantle what works, but to fix what doesn't. Help me distinguish between them based on your experience, not your attachment to the status quo." He considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than adversarial. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. "When Jonathan told me about the acquisition and your role in it, I assumed you'd be a corporate puppet, implementing Morrison's agenda without regard for the firm's unique character." "And now?" I prompted when he didn't continue. "Now I'm reserving judgment," he replied with a hint of a smile. "You've clearly done your homework on our operations. You handled that meeting with more skill than most managing partners I've encountered, and you're offering dialogue rather than dictation, which suggests at least some willingness to adapt your approach." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was openness, a significant improvement from the resistance he'd been organizing just an hour earlier. I'll consider your proposal, he continued. Not as a surrender, but as a potential path to influence. The firm does need to evolve. I've known that for years, even if I haven't championed it as vocally as perhaps I should have. That's all. I'm asking, I acknowledged. Consideration, not unconditional support. As Gerald left the conference room, I remained seated, reflecting on the morning's developments. The resistance had emerged exactly as anticipated, but its resolution had begun more quickly than I had dared hope. By offering a structured channel for input rather than simply demanding compliance, I had begun to transform opponents into stakeholders, still skeptical perhaps, but engaged rather than obstructionist. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Heard about the senior partners meeting. Dinner tonight to discuss? 7 p.m. at Morton's. I smiled slightly at the message. Of course he had heard, likely from Gerald directly after our conversation. His choice of Morton's was telling. It was where he typically took major clients, a neutral but prestigious territory for important negotiations. This wasn't a family dinner but a professional discussion, which suited me perfectly at this stage. 7 p.m. works, I replied. See you there. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of meetings, operational reviews, and implementation planning. By late afternoon, I had circulated the Partner Advisory Council charter as promised, detailing the election process, meeting cadence, and scope of authority. Within hours, several partners, including some who had been in the morning's resistance, meeting had expressed interest in serving. At 6:45 p.m., I arrived at Morton's Steakhouse, where the maitre d' immediately recognized me. Ms. Mitchell, your father is already seated. Please follow me. My father rose as I approached the table, extending his hand in a formal greeting that acknowledged our professional context. Olivia, thank you for making time this evening. Of course, I replied, taking the seat across from him. I assume Gerald briefed you on this morning's meeting. He smiled slightly, neither confirming nor denying. Let's order first. Business is always better discussed over a good meal. We placed our orders, filet mignon for him, salmon for me, a bottle of Cabernet to share, before turning to the matter at hand. Your Partner Advisory Council is an interesting approach, he began, confirming that Gerald had indeed provided details of our conversation. Strategic co-optation rather than confrontation. I prefer to think of it as meaningful inclusion, rather than co-optation, I corrected. The senior partners have valuable expertise. Ignoring that would be foolish, regardless of their initial resistance. He nodded appreciatively. A distinction with substance, and a wise approach. Gerald seemed not convinced, but intrigued. Coming from him, that's significant progress. And you? I asked directly. Where do you stand on the resistance effort? Gerald carefully positioned you as conflicted, rather than aligned when addressing the other partners. My father took a thoughtful sip of his wine before answering. I am conflicted, though not in the way Gerald assumes. He believes my conflict stems from your role as my daughter. The reality is more complex. Explain, I prompted. I built Mitchell Reynolds on certain principles: legal excellence, client, service, professional dignity. Those remain important to me. But I've also recognized for several years that our operational model was becoming outdated, our technological infrastructure increasingly inadequate. I simply lacked the expertise to address those weaknesses effectively. This was, perhaps, the most direct acknowledgement he had ever made of his own limitations, a significant evolution from the seemingly infallible figure who had dominated my childhood perception. The firm needs to change, he continued. I've known that longer than most of the senior partners realize. What I've struggled with is not whether change should happen, but how to lead it when many aspects of modern legal practice lie outside. My expertise. So you're not opposed to the integration, I clarified. I'm opposed to changes that would undermine our core legal excellence or client relationships, he specified. But many of the operational changes Morrison proposes, technology modernization, streamlined administrative processes, more sophisticated marketing approaches, these are overdue enhancements, not threats. His position surprised me. I had anticipated reluctant acceptance of inevitable change, not this level of affirmative recognition of its necessity. You never expressed this perspective when you were managing partner, I observed. The firm maintained traditional approaches under your leadership despite these market pressures. He nodded, acknowledging the critique. Leading change requires clarity about the destination and confidence in the path. I had neither. I knew our traditional model was becoming less competitive, but I wasn't sure what should replace it or how to implement that transformation without disrupting what was working well. This candid admission revealed a vulnerability I had rarely glimpsed in my father: uncertainty in his professional domain, awareness of the limits of his expertise. It humanized him in a way that decades of family dinners had never managed to accomplish. So, where does that leave us now? I asked. Gerald and others are looking to you for guidance on how to respond to the integration. Your position will influence theirs significantly. I know, he acknowledged, setting down his wine glass deliberately. Which is why I wanted this conversation before taking any public position. I need to understand your vision more clearly. Not just the operational changes, but how you see the firm's identity evolving under Morrison's ownership. For the next hour, over expertly prepared steaks and a second glass of wine, we engaged in the most substantive professional conversation of our relationship. I outlined my vision for integrating Morrison's operational excellence with Mitchell, Reynolds' legal expertise, creating a hybrid model that preserved the firm's professional culture while modernizing its infrastructure and processes. My father listened attentively, asking incisive questions about client transition protocols, associate development programs, and partner autonomy in case management. His concerns were legitimate and specific, focused on preserving genuine value rather than resisting change for its own sake. Your approach is more nuanced than I expected, he admitted as we finished our meal. There's real thought behind the integration plan, not just corporate efficiency metrics being blindly applied to legal practice. I spent 6 months studying Morrison's operational model while simultaneously analyzing Mitchell, Reynolds' strengths, and weaknesses, I reminded him. This wasn't a hasty acquisition or a generic integration playbook. He nodded, acknowledging the thoroughness of the preparation. And my role in this new structure? We've discussed it generally, but I'd like to understand your specific expectations. That depends partly on what you want, I replied honestly. You have options. You could focus exclusively on high-value client relationships and complex litigation, stepping away from management entirely. You could serve as a strategic advisor to the integration team, helping us navigate the cultural aspects of the transition. Or you could take a more public role, visibly supporting the changes to help bring the resistant partners along. He considered these alternatives thoughtfully. And if none of those precisely fits what I envision for myself, then propose an alternative, I said simply. My goal isn't to constrain you, but to leverage your expertise and influence most effectively during this transition. The openness of this approach seemed to surprise him. You're offering me significant autonomy despite effectively replacing me as managing partner. I'm recognizing your value to the firm going forward, I corrected. That value isn't diminished by the change in formal authority. If anything, freeing you from administrative burdens allows your legal expertise and client relationships to create even more impact. As we concluded dinner and prepared to depart, my father extended his hand across the table. I'll support the integration publicly, he said, his decision apparently made. Not with blind endorsement of every detail, but with clear acknowledgement of its necessity and potential benefits. That should help with Gerald and the others. Thank you, I said sincerely, recognizing the significance of this commitment. Your support will make a substantial difference in how quickly we can implement the most critical changes. He smiled slightly, a hint of his old confidence returning. I built that firm from nothing, Olivia. I won't stand in the way of what it needs to become now, even if that future looks different than I once imagined. As we parted outside the restaurant, he added, Sunday dinner this weekend? Your mother insists, and Jake has apparently processed his feelings enough to be civil. The casual invitation represented another small step in the normalization of our family dynamics, alongside our evolving professional relationship. Sunday works, I agreed. Tell Mom I'll bring dessert. Driving home that evening, I reflected on the day's progress. The resistance had emerged as expected, but had begun to transform into engagement more quickly than anticipated. My father's support, while conditional, would significantly accelerate acceptance among the more traditional partners. The Partner Advisory Council would provide a structured channel for incorporating legitimate expertise while maintaining clear direction. The integration was far from complete. Cultural transformations never happen overnight, particularly in organizations as tradition-bound as law firms. But the initial resistance had been met with strategic inclusion rather than authoritarian force, creating pathways for evolution rather than battle lines for confrontation. And in that approach lay perhaps the most important lesson of the day. True leadership isn't about imposing will through formal authority. It's about creating conditions where people choose to align their efforts with necessary change, where resistance transforms into contribution, where skeptics become stakeholders in a shared future. My father had dismissed me as just a secretary at Thanksgiving dinner. 1 week into the integration, he was now publicly supporting my vision for the firm's future and privately acknowledging the limits of his own approach. Not because I had demanded his recognition or wielded my new authority as a weapon, but because I had demonstrated competence, clarity, and a willingness to incorporate legitimate concerns into the path forward. That transformation, from dismissal to respect, from resistance to engagement, represented the true measure of leadership effectiveness. And it was only just beginning. 3 weeks into the integration process, Mitchell, Reynolds was beginning to show signs of transformation. The physical changes were the most visible, construction crews replacing the outdated reception area with a modern welcome space featuring Morrison's sleek design aesthetic while maintaining subtle nods to the firm's legal heritage. The technological evolution was equally apparent, with new workstations being installed throughout the office and IT specialists conducting training sessions on the enhanced practice management system. Less visible, but more significant, were the operational changes unfolding behind the scenes. The Partner Advisory Council, now fully formed and meeting twice weekly, had begun actively contributing to implementation decisions. Practice areas were being thoughtfully realigned based on client needs rather than historical divisions. The compensation structure was evolving to balance traditional partner equity with performance metrics focused on client satisfaction and operational efficiency. I arrived early that Wednesday morning, using the quiet hours before the office filled to review progress reports from each integration workstream. The firm's energy was different now, still marked by occasional resistance and persistent questions, but increasingly characterized by engagement and cautious optimism as tangible improvements began to emerge. My assistant Clara appeared at my door with a steaming cup of coffee. "Your 8:30 with the marketing team is confirmed," she informed me. "And Ms. Morrison asked if you could call her before the executive committee meeting at 11. "Thank you, Clara," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Clara had been my father's executive assistant for 15 years before transitioning to support me during the integration. Her institutional knowledge was invaluable, and her gradual shift from guarded professionalism to genuine collaboration had been a small but significant indicator of changing attitudes within the firm. Also, she added with a slight hesitation, Mr. Winthrop asked to see you when you have a moment. He said it was important, but not urgent. Gerald requesting a meeting rather than demanding one represented another subtle evolution. Since our confrontation 3 weeks earlier, he had maintained a careful neutrality, neither actively supporting the integration nor actively opposing it. His participation on the Partner Advisory Council had been technically compliant, but minimally engaged, offering measured critiques without constructive alternatives. I'll see him at 9:45, I decided, curious about what had prompted this outreach. At precisely 9:45, Gerald Winthrop appeared at my office door, his tall frame impeccably attired in a charcoal suit that had probably cost more than some associate's monthly salary. He carried a leather portfolio similar to the one he had brought to our first confrontation, suggesting this meeting would involve substantive discussion rather than casual conversation. "Thank you for making time, Olivia," he said, taking the visitor's chair I indicated. "I've been reviewing the litigation practice realignment proposal, and I believe there's an opportunity we're missing." This was unexpected, not just his initiative in scheduling the meeting, but his framing it around opportunity rather than objection. I set aside the document I had been reviewing and gave him my full attention. "I'm listening," I said. Gerald opened his portfolio and extracted a detailed analysis document. The current plan divides litigation into 3 specialty areas: corporate, employment, and general. It's a logical structure based on Morrison's operational model for professional service practices. But it overlooks an emerging opportunity in regulatory compliance litigation that could significantly enhance both client retention and new business development. He proceeded to outline a comprehensive proposal for creating a dedicated regulatory compliance practice that integrated preventative consulting with litigation defense, leveraging the firm's existing expertise in several regulated industries to create a specialized service offering that few competitors could match. As he explained the concept, I was struck by both its strategic merit and the fact that Gerald had developed it independently, without being asked or directed. The proposal demonstrated not just legal expertise, but business acumen, identifying a market opportunity that aligned client needs with the firm's capabilities while creating differentiation from competitors. "This is impressive work, Gerald," I acknowledged when he concluded his presentation. "You've identified a genuine opportunity that our current structure doesn't adequately address. What prompted this analysis?" He closed his portfolio deliberately before answering. "Your father mentioned something at dinner last week, that the integration was an opportunity to rebuild the firm's structure based on future client needs, rather than historical divisions. It made me consider what those future needs might be, particularly in my area of expertise. And this was the result of that consideration," I observed, indicating his proposal. "One possibility," he corrected. "I'm not suggesting this is the only approach, but it does leverage our existing strengths while creating a more compelling value proposition for clients facing increasingly complex regulatory environments." I nodded, appreciating both the substance of his proposal and the shift in his positioning it represented. Gerald was no longer merely resisting change or reluctantly accepting it. He was actively engaging with it, applying his expertise to shape the firm's future direction. "I'd like to have the integration team review this in detail and incorporate viable elements into our practice structure," I said. "Would you be willing to present it at tomorrow's executive committee meeting? Eleanor will be there, and she's particularly interested in how we position our service offerings to align with client priorities." A brief flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by measured satisfaction. "I'd be happy to present it," he agreed. "Though I'd appreciate your perspective on any aspects that might need refinement before then." "The core concept is sound," I assured him. "The implementation timeline might need adjustment to align with other integration work streams, but that's a detail we can address after gaining executive approval for the strategic direction." As Gerald departed with arrangements to meet later that day to refine his presentation, I reflected on the significance of this interaction. His proposal itself was valuable, a thoughtful enhancement to our practice structure that could create meaningful competitive advantage. But more important was what it represented. A senior partner who had initially led the resistance now actively contributing to the firm's transformation, applying his expertise constructively rather than defensively. This was the tipping point I had been working toward, the moment when key influencers within the firm began to see the integration not as something being done to them, but as something they could help shape. Gerald's initiative suggested we had crossed that threshold, at least with some of the senior leadership. My phone rang, interrupting these reflections. Eleanor Morrison's name appeared on the display. "Good morning, Eleanor," I answered. "Olivia?" she replied, her tone suggesting she was already in the midst of her typically packed day. "I've been reviewing the integration progress reports. The pace is impressive. You're ahead of schedule on system implementation and practice realignment. The Partner Advisory Council has been unexpectedly helpful," I acknowledged. Once they engaged constructively, many of the anticipated obstacles disappeared. "That's the update I was hoping for," she said. "The reason I wanted to speak before the executive committee meeting is to discuss accelerating the next phase of our professional services integration strategy." I felt a small warning flicker at the back of my mind. Accelerating in what way? The Mitchell-Reynolds integration is proceeding more smoothly than projected. That creates an opportunity to advance our timeline for expanding our legal services portfolio through additional acquisitions. The warning flicker intensified. Additional acquisitions? Eleanor, we're 3 weeks into a complex integration that will require at least 6 months to fully implement. Beginning another acquisition process now would divide resources and attention at a critical moment. "I understand your concern," she replied, her tone still measured but with an undertone of determination I recognized from previous strategic discussions. "But market conditions are favorable for consolidation right now. Several mid-sized firms are struggling with the same challenges Mitchell-Reynolds faced, creating acquisition opportunities at advantageous valuations, which would still be available after we've completed this integration," I pointed out. "Some would, others won't," she countered. "Particularly Donovan and Walsh, a boutique litigation firm specializing in the healthcare sector. They've approached us about a potential acquisition, but they're also in discussions with 2 other bidders. If we wait 6 months, that opportunity will be gone." Now I understood the urgency behind her call. Donovan and Walsh was indeed a valuable potential acquisition target. Their healthcare litigation expertise would complement Mitchell-Reynolds' existing practice areas while opening access to a lucrative client segment. From a purely strategic perspective, Eleanor's analysis was sound. But strategy exists in the context of implementation reality, and that reality included a complex organizational transformation still in its early stages. Dividing focus now could undermine the progress we'd made and jeopardize the carefully cultivated buy-in from key stakeholders like Gerald. "I share your interest in Donovan and Walsh," I said carefully, "but I'm concerned about the implementation. Risks of pursuing that acquisition while Mitchell-Reynolds is still in transition. We've just begun to gain momentum with partner engagement and cultural integration. Introducing another acquisition now could create the perception that we're prioritizing expansion over successful integration." "Perception can be managed," Eleanor replied. "The executive committee sees this as a strategic opportunity that aligns perfectly with our planned growth trajectory. The question is whether to pursue it now or risk losing it to competitors." Her framing made it clear that this wasn't merely a suggestion, but a direction the executive committee was inclined to take. I had 2 choices: align myself with that direction while working to shape its implementation, or oppose it directly and potentially position myself against the corporate leadership that had promoted me to this role. "I understand the strategic rationale," I acknowledged. "Before we proceed, I'd like to conduct a rapid impact assessment on how pursuing Donovan and Walsh would affect our current integration timeline and resource allocation." That would allow us to make an informed decision about sequencing and support requirements. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering this response. That's reasonable, she finally agreed. How quickly can you complete that assessment? I can have preliminary findings by Monday, I promised. That would give us a factual basis for determining whether to proceed immediately or to sequence the acquisitions with a short interval between them. Monday works, she confirmed. I appreciate your thoroughness, Olivia. It's one of the reasons you've been so effective in this role. After ending the call, I sat back in my chair, considering the implications of this new development. Eleanor's push for accelerated expansion reflected Morrison's corporate growth imperatives, completely logical from their perspective, but potentially disruptive to the delicate balance we were establishing within Mitchell Reynolds. My concern wasn't with the acquisition strategy itself, but with its timing and implementation. The firm was just beginning to embrace the integration, with partners like Gerald moving from resistance to contribution. Introducing another acquisition prematurely could reignite uncertainty and resistance, undermining our progress. I needed to find a path that balanced Morrison's strategic objectives with Mitchell Reynolds' integration needs, a solution that would satisfy Eleanor's expansion goals without disrupting the cultural transformation underway. And I needed to do it while maintaining my credibility with both constituencies. My intercom buzzed, interrupting these thoughts. Ms. Mitchell, your father is here. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. This was unusual. My father rarely came to my office, preferring to have me come to his when we needed to discuss matters. His unscheduled arrival suggested something significant had occurred. Send him in, Clara, I instructed. My father entered with the purposeful stride that had intimidated opposing counsel for decades. His expression was composed but serious as he closed the door behind him. You've heard from Eleanor, he said without preamble, making it a statement rather than a question. I raised an eyebrow, surprised by his awareness of the conversation. About Donovan and Walsh? Yes, just now. How did you know? Because Marshall? Donovan called me 30 minutes ago, he replied, taking a seat across from me. We worked together on the medical device liability cases last year. He wanted my perspective on Morrison as a potential acquirer. This was an interesting development. The fact that Donovan had reached out to my father suggested that despite the formal acquisition negotiations happening at the corporate level, the personal and professional relationships between the firm's attorneys remained significant factors in the process. And what perspective did you offer? I asked, genuinely curious about how my father was positioning himself in this situation. I told him the integration has been more thoughtful than I initially expected, he answered candidly. That Morrison has respected our core legal practice while modernizing our operational approach. That the cultural transition has been challenging, but ultimately productive. His characterization was fair and balanced, neither overselling the integration as painless nor portraying it as destructive. The fact that he had characterized it positively to a fellow firm leader represented significant progress from his initial shock at the acquisition announcement. Marshall has concerns about maintaining their healthcare specialization, my father continued. They've built their reputation on deep expertise in a niche area. He's worried about being absorbed into a general practice structure that dilutes that specialization. A legitimate concern, I acknowledged, though our approach has actually been to enhance practice specialization while integrating the operational infrastructure. Gerald is presenting a proposal tomorrow for a dedicated regulatory compliance practice that maintains specialized legal expertise while leveraging shared operational resources. My father nodded thoughtfully. That's essentially what I told Marshall. That the integration has been about modernizing how we operate without compromising what we know. He paused, studying me for a moment before continuing. He asked if I would facilitate a meeting between him and you, not as formal acquisition negotiation, but as a candid conversation about the integration experience from the legal practice perspective. I told him I would discuss it with you before committing. This request represented both an opportunity and a complication. Direct communication with Donovan could help address the cultural concerns that often derail professional service firm acquisitions. But engaging with him outside the formal corporate negotiation process might be perceived by Eleanor as circumventing proper channels. "What's your assessment of Donovan?" I asked, valuing my father's insight into the personal dynamics that would influence any potential integration. "He's brilliant legally, somewhat traditional operationally," my father replied, "not resistant to change, but cautious about it. His primary concern is preserving the professional excellence they've built, not his personal position or compensation. If he can be convinced that Morrison's approach enhances rather than diminishes that excellence, he could become a valuable advocate for the acquisition among his partners." This aligned with my own limited knowledge of Donovan and Walsh's reputation. Their healthcare litigation practice was widely respected for its specialized expertise and client service excellence. Their operational model, however, was as traditional as Mitchell, Reynolds's had been, potentially limiting their growth and long-term sustainability despite their current strong market position. "A conversation could be valuable," I agreed, "but it needs to complement rather than complicate the formal acquisition process. I'll need to inform Eleanor that I'm meeting with him, positioning it as addressing the cultural aspects of integration while leaving the financial and structural negotiations to the corporate team." My father nodded his approval of this approach. Marshall suggested Friday morning, breakfast at the downtown club, neutral territory, private enough for candid conversation. "Friday works," I confirmed. "I appreciate you bringing this to me directly rather than simply arranging it." He smiled slightly. "I'm learning the proper channels in our new structure. It's an adjustment, but not an unreasonable one." This simple acknowledgement represented significant evolution in our professional relationship. My father was adapting to the new reality, not just accepting it grudgingly, but actively finding his place within it. "How are you finding your new role?" I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective now that the initial shock had faded. "Focusing on complex litigation without the administrative burdens of managing the firm? Surprisingly liberating," he admitted. "I've taken on 2 cases in the past week that I would have had to decline before due to management responsibilities. And without constant operational decisions interrupting my day, my case preparation has been more thorough and focused." "The role suits you," I observed. "It does," he agreed, "though I sometimes miss being at the center of firm decisions. Old habits die hard after 30 years. "Your perspective is still valued," I assured him. "The Partner Advisory Council frequently cites your input on various integration questions." "At your suggestion, I imagine," he said shrewdly. "Initially, perhaps," I acknowledged, "but now, because they genuinely see the value of your experience. The firm still needs your expertise, Dad, just in a different capacity than before." He nodded, accepting this assessment. Which brings me to the other reason for my visit. Gerald showed me his regulatory compliance practice proposal. It's excellent work, strategically sound, operationally feasible, genuinely innovative in how it positions our services. "I agree," I said. "He's presenting it to the executive committee tomorrow. You should know that proposal represents a significant shift in Gerald's perspective," my father continued. 3 weeks ago, he was organizing resistance to the integration. Now he's designing new practice structures that embrace it. That transformation didn't happen by accident. I raised an eyebrow, curious where he was going with this observation. "Your approach to the resistance was masterful, Olivia," he said directly. "You could have used your authority to demand compliance or marginalize the skeptics. Instead, you created pathways for them to contribute constructively to the change. That's leadership of a high order, the kind that transforms opposition into engagement." Coming from my father, this assessment carried particular weight. He had built his career on persuasive leadership, both in the courtroom and in the firm, His recognition of my leadership approach represented a level of professional respect I had sought for years. "I learned from observation," I replied, acknowledging his influence without directly attributing it to him. "Watching how different leadership styles affect organizational outcomes over time." He smiled, recognizing the diplomatic phrasing. "Some models to emulate, others to avoid. All providing useful lessons in different contexts," I offered diplomatically. "Fair enough," he conceded with a slight laugh. "I'll let you prepare for your meeting with Eleanor. Shall I tell Marshall you'll join him for breakfast on Friday?" "Please do," I confirmed. "And thank you for facilitating that connection. It could be valuable for both firms." After my father departed, I turned my attention to the complex challenge Eleanor had presented. The Donovan and Walsh acquisition made strategic sense, but its timing created significant implementation risks for the Mitchell-Reynolds integration. I needed to develop an approach that would satisfy Morrison's growth